So you can see the instructions for how to access the language you want to access on the screen now. I will take that opportunity as well to ask everyone that will be speaking, even our presenters, but also whenever you come on in the discussion part, to ask questions, to try to speak relatively slowly, because that makes it easier as well for translators to more accurately translate what you're saying. Just to show the organizations that are part of this network and have been supporting the preparation of the series of webinars from the GCF Watch for the past 3 years. A special thanks to our colleagues from AIDA, who are spearheading the efforts of the GCF Watch to prepare this series of webinars, and they're here as well with us today. So as you probably also know, if you've been following, this is the second session of the series of webinars for this year. And this agenda for today will be focused heavily on the experience in monitoring and evaluation, well, CSO-led monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of projects on the ground, financed by the GCF, of course. But we'll start first in the agenda with an update on the last board meeting and what follows from there, which will be given by Claire Miranda from the Asian People's Movement for Depth and Development. And then we will move to like a very short introduction on my side, and then the specific case studies and experiences of our colleagues from the Namibia Nature Foundation and the Unidad Ecológica Salvadoreña from Latin America and Africa. And then we'll open the floor for discussion. So we really invite you all to ask your questions on the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, I think we can make you come in and like speak as well. So, and if possible, please specify to whom the question is addressed so that we know who to direct your questions. And just so you know, there's going to be a last session in November, which will cover other important topics around the GCF. It's quite vague, but I mean, there are a lot of important topics around the GCF that we have received, that we have heard from other civil society that they'll be interested in hearing. So there'll be a session trying to address some of those important topics in November. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Claire to start our agenda for today. So Claire, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Berta. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you again to all colleagues for organizing this and for having me to be part of this very important webinar series. So I was tasked to share some of the key updates from the last board meeting, which is also a timely update before we head to another board meeting of the B37, which is happening, I think, in a few weeks already. So the last board meeting, or the 36th board meeting of the Green Climate Fund, was held in Songdo, South Korea last July 10 to 13. It's a 4-day event, which with some sessions held in closed doors, and it is the last board meeting before the pledging conference, or the second replenishment of the fund, which was recently held last October 5 in Germany. And given this, because it's the board meeting before the pledging conference, several discussions at B36 were about what is going on in the entire replenishment process. There have been consultation meetings made before B36 and in the lead up to October 5, where developing country board members made sure that the policies around the second replenishment reflect the obligation of developed countries. So they have emphasized that under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, Annex 1 countries, or developed countries, they call themselves as Annex 1 countries under the UNFCCC, they have the obligation to provide climate finance. And their pledges are not mere donations, as reflected in some of the languages of of the documents related to GCF2 or the replenishment process, because developed countries have tried to refer to themselves as donors. But developing countries or the governments of the Global South, representatives of the Global South, they insisted that um, they should be referred to as contributors. Um, Developing country board members also argued that the Green Climate Fund must do some sort of enforcement measures, especially to contributors with unfulfilled and delayed pledges, citing, of course, the case of the United States that promised 3 billion in 2014 but only delivered 1 billion as of the last board meeting. But now, the GCF website also confirmed that they have already gave 2 billion to the fund, which is still a billion short from what they promised in 2014. And then there's also the UK, because it has delayed its delivery for its contribution in the GCF1 or the first replenishment process. And the Secretariat, because of this delay for delivering their pledges, the Secretariat confirmed that such delay has affected the fund's commitment authority and caused delays in the approval of funding proposals and further delays in disbursement of funds to approve projects. Developing countries also urge the GCF to require a minimum amount for contribution, since what has been happening so far is that the pledges are voluntary and is operating in some sort of a trust system. The countries or the rich countries argued that having a minimum amount will only discourage other institutions such as philanthropic foundations, individuals, the private sector, and even developing countries. They will be discouraged from putting in money to the GCF. Of course, developing country board members strongly opposed. As you know, not only in the GCF, but also in other spaces where climate finance is being discussed, there's really a deliberate attempt from developed countries to remove any reference to CBDR, or the common but differentiated responsibility, which is a crucial principle under the convention. They're trying to expand the contributions also from developing countries. And right now, some developed countries are contributing less and less to the GCF, and they're trying to share the burden to developing countries as if we in the Global South have the same obligation and responsibility for causing the climate crisis. But clearly, under the UNFCCC, the principle of equity and CBDR are common but differentiated responsibility. It's very clear that Annex 1 countries or the rich countries, they must provide finance since they have contributed so much more to climate change. So at B36, the last board meeting, the debate whether or not to have a minimum amount for contributions was resolved when the board agreed to set a minimum target only for contributions in the form of loans and no more for grants. So there's that about the discussions around the replenishment and the policies around the pledging conference. Another key issue discussed at the last board meeting was the update of the strategic plan for the GCF or for years 2024 to 2027. And prior to that board meeting, there was a need to resolve several issues under the strategic plan. And these include issues around access, particularly on how to improve and increase funding allocation and access of direct access entities. There are also issues around budget allocation for adaptation projects. There's also that discussion around leveraging private sector finance and other issues or internal issues raised by the IEU in their assessment report. IEU is an independent evaluation unit of the GCF, and they try to provide these assessment reports and recommend what are the steps that should be taken by the GCF in order to improve its operations. And an attempt to resolve all these issues before B36, the co-chairs from Pakistan and from the United States. They arranged several informal meetings with the board, and so far, the version of the updated strategic plan presented at the last board meeting, it received positive feedback from the board, but of course, there's still the difference of positions between developed versus developing country board members. For the developed country board members, they want the GCF to compete, quote unquote, compete with other institutions in greening the financial system. And this should be reflected in the fund's strategic plan. They wanted the GCF to be a major player in the finance architecture. They wanted the GCF to incorporate the innovative finance instruments and invite more private sector to quote unquote invest in GCF projects. Basically, it sounds like they wanted the GCF take the direction of how banks operate, which means there will be more loans and lending in terms of the financial instruments that the GCF will implement. And at some point, the board member from France also reiterated the earlier point of expanding the donor base, implying that multilateral development banks such as the World Bank, ADB, the African Development Bank, and other developing countries, they should all pitch in and give money to the GCF. So basically, just they wanted the GCF to be a bank, operate like a bank, and then have more investors, expand the investors, and provide um, finance for the GCF, and that includes the multilateral development banks and other developing countries. So for developing countries, on the other hand, their comments about the updated strategic plan were all about increasing the fund, increasing its ambition, and therefore improving the fund's programming capacity, recognizing the fact that the urgency and scale of action needed for adaptation and mitigation needs right now is way greater now than several years ago. Therefore, they wanted the GCF to work in order to increase its targets and come up with concrete action plans to meet them. And in response to what the rich countries said to share the burden of mobilizing resources for the GCF, some developing country board members were really strong and reiterated the importance of equity and CBDR, and that these principles shouldn't be removed, shouldn't be forgotten or reinterpreted so that they can avoid their obligation. Climate finance under the UNFCCC is the responsibility of developed countries. So there's that conversation around the strategic plan and what direction the fund should take in the coming years. Another key area that the board spent time discussing is the batch of funding proposals for approval. Funding proposals for approval. So for B36, a total of 12 funding proposals were considered, amounting to $755 million. Majority or 73% are adaptation projects, which is quite rare because in the past, it's all about mitigation projects. Of these projects, of these 12 projects, 8 are submitted by international access entities and 4 projects form direct access entities. And majority of the financial instruments in the projects are in loans, despite the fact that many are adaptation projects. So we have been seeing this trend already in the GCF that many adaptation projects are being considered, but in terms of the financial instruments used, it's in the form of loans. The 12 projects that were presented to the board were all approved, but FP210 and FP211, both from Acumen, had several issues, forcing the board to decide through a voting process. So FP210 or Kawisafi 2 is an equity fund that will utilize a blended finance structure, but upon examining, it's also because of the help of the CSO Observer Network, we were alarmed that this project supports the use of biofuels, which was also opposed by the Independent Technical Advisory Panel, and that the fund will open doors for carbon markets and waste to energy programs, which is totally opposite from the mandate and the principles enshrined in the UNFCCC and the GCF, for that matter. SP 211, or called as the hardest to reach, that's the title of the funding proposal. It's a multi-country investment initiative to deploy capital and assistance for off-grid solar companies in African states with great energy access problems. The contention for this project is its lack of clarity for its adaptation component and claims for fully complying with free, prior, and informed consent of affected in the area. In fact, it is not fully complied with FPIC. And our colleagues from the Indigenous Peoples Network can also affirm that its compliance with FPIC isn't really that good. But despite these contentions for these two funding proposals, when the board when decided through a vote, majority approved the project, and they were all in agreement that Acumen will be able to fulfill Acumen will be able to access funds from the GCF once it has fulfilled the condition. Although he also approved the project based on its merits, he had a last minute objection to both funding proposals, particularly on the allegations made to his country about forced labor and human rights violations. But again, it was not considered by the board because they were deciding based on the merits of the funding proposal. Another item last board meeting is the accreditation proposal. So there were 4 new applicants and 3 reaccreditation applicants. They were all approved easily. For the reaccreditation applicants, we had the Development Bank from West Africa, the Development Bank of Latin America, and the French Development Agency. The board has approved 3 DAEs, or Direct Sri Lanka, and 1 international. So in a nutshell, those are the key issues that were discussed last board 36. Given that, since we're heading towards another board meeting in a few weeks, what are the issues that we are expecting to come up at the next board meeting and the upcoming COP28 in Dubai? Our fearless forecast is that the board will probably be talking again about the recently concluded replenishment process, with developed countries boasting how some of them have doubled their contributions, that they're really committed to ambitious climate action, while developing countries would probably raise the underwhelming amount pledged for the second replenishment of the fund. So for everyone's information, the initial resource mobilization of the Green Climate Fund was able to mobilize $10 billion. For the first replenishment, it was less than $10 billion. And for this second replenishment, it didn't go higher again than $10 billion, despite the repetitive calls of the CSOs of many developing country representatives that the climate needs, the mitigation and adaptation needs at the moment are increasing by the minute, and we should be able to scale up the resources for the Green Climate Fund. Another issue that will probably come up in the next board meeting and probably also in COP is that there's a new document that is to be considered at the GCF board meeting that will promote sustainable investments under the GCF Trust Fund in the World Bank, which, if we are to look closely, it is another attempt to transform the GCF into a bank rather than a grants-based mechanism mandated to support the adaptation and mitigation needs of developing countries. It will probably introduce another set of financial instruments that will just promote more lending, loans, and therefore debt to the recipient countries. At COP in December, happening November to December this year, we are expected to see fight between developed and developing countries over negotiating text. CBD are the common but differentiated responsibility. These are being done by developed countries in order to further water down their obligations and shift the burden of providing adequate climate finance to developing countries. Of course, there is the discussion also about the establishment and operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund, which is another area where we can see polarized views from developed and developing countries. This is also quite related with the GCF because there has been a trend since last year, since the COP last year, that multilateral development banks, particularly the World Bank, to have an increased role in terms of mobilizing and disbursing climate finance in general. So right now in the loss and damage discussions, there is a proposal from the US as expected, from the US, and eventually it was supported by the EU to have the loss and damage fund housed under the World Bank, which means we say goodbye to the principles laid down in the UNFCCC. It will fully operate under the World Bank. But that's another conversation we can have maybe in another webinar. So that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise them in the chat and in the Q&A section of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. And I understand that you need to leave quite soon, but do you have any, so that before you leave, maybe we can ask some questions if there are questions on the chat so that you have the opportunity to answer them before you leave. So I think there was one very specific one on the document to see these debates, but that has already been answered. And I will also point at other, maybe we'll add in the chat other sources of summaries from the GCF as well. But I think there is another one from Fiona, or where does it say, I guess she means documents where it states that the UNFCCC, or well, I guess the UNFCCC not, because the UNFCCC doesn't finance anything, but where does the GCF, which documents would contain anything that says the GCF cannot co-finance commercial activities such as carbon markets? So if you have an answer to that, yeah.
I can type the answer. Just I'll look for the document itself and respond via chat if that's okay.
Sure, that's great. I mean, if you can share a policy that says it, that's even better then. Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Thanks very much.
I'll type it in there. Thanks.
Thank you, Claire. And I think that's the one question I can see, because the other ones, as I said, they have already been answered. So if there are no further questions, then just in order to have more space for discussion, I'll just move forward with the actual topics of monitoring and implementation. But thanks so much for putting us up to speed with what's going on in the GCF. So I will start just with a presentation on very general outline of the CSO-led monitoring and evaluation from our experience, but I think our colleagues Toini and Maite will go into more detail on what that actually looks on the ground. So this is more of an introduction. So just to outline where this experience come from, in a consortium of 10, well, actually over 10 organizations covering 10 countries, German Watch with partners from all of these countries, and Toini and from the Namibia Nature Foundation was one of those partners, implemented a project targeted at civil society and the role of civil society within the GCF. The purpose of that was to contribute to the GCF funded activity, to kind of ensuring that the GCF funded activities actually achieve the transformative effect that is needed in line with national and regional priorities, and to really achieve what the GCF sets itself to achieve, which is the paradigm shift towards low emissions and climate resilient development. So the rationale for involving the civil society organizations was like the belief that the civil society can and should play a crucial role as provider in different areas of engagement with the GCF, whether it is providing ideas for projects, encouraging and serving as intermediaries for the social and participatory monitoring, which is what this webinar is about, as partners for implementation of activities, and also as supervising authority, and many other important roles that civil society can play to make sure that there is a real paradigm shift and a real response to the needs and priorities of the local communities beyond just the national level. So the project included participatory monitoring and evaluation activities as part of the overall, let's say, outcomes expected. And they were framed around a series of different purposes or objectives, which included basically engaging civil society in ensuring that the GCF funded projects and programs promote the goals that they're supposed to be promoting, which is, as you know, low emissions, climate resilient development. Also ensuring that the focus of these activities is in line with national priorities and strategies and local priorities and strategies as well, while at the same time playing a role of promoting accountability. But in this case, accountability was defined as accountability towards the communities and the people that were directly affected by the GCF. So not in the traditional sense of accountability to the contributors or to the fund, which is what the usual reporting is for, but to also promote accountability towards the communities that are supposed to be benefiting or could be negatively impacted by GCF funded activities. And in this process, to also promote learning from all stakeholders, community, civil society, national authorities, and implementing entities, in how to target interventions better, how to reach the local level, how to promote paradigm shift, etc. So the idea was quite simple at the beginning. It was basically just the implementation of a series of activities, starting with, like establishing links with relevant stakeholders. So in this case, the GCF worked through what they call national designated authorities, which is a government organization that is the focal point or the point of entry in the country towards the GCF. But also the accredited entities, which is basically all the agencies that are accredited by the GCF and can, present projects and implement projects, and any other stakeholder that's relevant to any specific project or program. So the first step was to really approach all of these stakeholders and the communities and try to establish the necessary links to implement the monitoring and evaluation activities. And we'll probably hear some more about how that usually works, but it's not always easy to approach accredited entities or implementing entities. There is often a pushback a little bit also on the let's say the authority that civil society has, or let's say basically the authority that civil society has in implementing these monitoring and evaluation activities. Then there was also an inclusion of field visits. So there was actually visits on the ground to the places where GCF funded projects or programs were being implemented, to kind of reach out to the impacted communities and local people on the ground. And then in order to promote the learning, there was also the organization of in-country webinars and workshops to share these learnings and kind of build together an understanding of how GCF projects and programs were being implemented. And in order to guide this work, there was the design of a very flexible, very minimal and flexible framework that local civil society organizations could adapt to their own realities. because the realities on the ground are different in terms of the types of projects, but also how advanced these projects are, and also the needs and priorities of the local people. So the very flexible framework was basically included 4 main elements or pillars. The first was like the need to define roles, basically the roles and levels of engagement of different stakeholders. And in here, as I mentioned before, it was like also like, how the national designated authorities, the accredited entities, implementing entities, communities, local groups, other local authorities would be involved in this process. There was also deciding what to measure and what to evaluate. So projects and programs funded by the GCF usually already have a results framework where there's outcomes, outputs, impacts, objectives that are clearly defined. But so one possibility was just to follow that existing results framework and try to see whether the impact that was included there was being achieved. But alternatively, there was also other ways and other frameworks that could be used, because at the end of the day, the definition of success of a project could be different for the local people. So if the local people didn't think that the existing results framework spoke to them or wasn't adequate or appropriate, there was also the possibility of thinking about a different way of defining success, more locally led. So basically, it was kind of deciding what was going to be measured or not. And this could also include, of course, measuring the impact and implementation of gender action plans that are part of GCF projects and programs, or also look at the implementation of safeguards, environmental and social safeguards, and to see whether those were actually being respected or not. So there was different levels that could be chosen. Then obviously there was the definition of the monitoring and evaluation approach, exactly what activities, how they were going to be organized, what frameworks were going to be used. That was also open for different partners to adapt it to their own needs. And finally, the sharing and using of results. I mean, who are these results shared with and with what purposes? And to what levels? Does it stay at the national level? Can it be moved up to the, let's say, does it stay at the local level? Can it be moved, or is it relevant to move it at the national level? Or should it be also moved at the international level with the GCF to bring up issues that have, have come up through monitoring and evaluation? So with that, I want to stop there because I think it's more interesting to see what that looks like when it's implemented on the ground. But just to give you an idea of sort of a way of looking at how to frame monitoring and evaluation that is participatory and led by civil society. So I think our first case study will be presented by Toini Mutenya from the Namibia Nature Foundation. So Toini, the floor is yours. Hi, we can see you, but we cannot hear you. Or is it just me? No, your microphone seems to be off, like open, but we can't hear you. Okay. Well, so Toini is going to try to rejoin. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether we should just move to the next, to Maite, if you're ready, and then we can come back so that, we move forward and we still have space for discussion. Okay, so Maite, if you can start, that would be great. Thanks. And we'll wait for Toini to rejoin.
Great. Thank you so much, Berta. Not a problem. Just give me 2 seconds whilst I get the presentation going. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can see it. Thanks.
Great. Okay, great. My name is Maite Smet. I am the Executive Director of the International Analog Forestry Network, and I'm here today with Rosalia from UNES to tell you about our experience with a citizen observation process that we've been leading on in El Salvador regarding the project FP089, or also known as Reclima. I will be telling you a little bit more about the process itself that we've been taking forward, and Rosalia will be sharing more about the findings that we've had, because we're almost at the end of the monitoring process in El Salvador. So we can also tell you a little bit more about what has been happening there. So let's get started, and so I won't delay you. And if I'm speaking too fast, also just let me know. So, so why and how we started this process. So from IFN, well, firstly, to frame this, that IFN is part of the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action, GAGA, which is this large network, global network, bringing together many organizations working on gender, environmental, and climate justice. And so within that work, IFN has been engaging more around environmental and climate justice processes, particularly around climate financing. And so since 2021, we started engaging in the GCF Latin American and Caribbean Gender Group, with the aim of learning more about the GCF, its influence in Latin America, although IFN also works globally. And particularly understanding where there are projects or financing going to adaptation projects that are linked to food sovereignty, agroecology, things that are related very much to the work that we do at IFN. With this work together with others, we were approached by WeDo to explore the possibility of leading an on-site monitoring process for the implementation of a project funded by the GCF in Latin America. And this is where we had an opportunity for collaboration with other organizations that are part of GAGA to see how we could do this together, because although we were very interested in doing this, we don't have all the expertise. So we really thought it would be important to work with others to get this going. So, and that is how we've created an alliance or a consortium of organizations working together, including the Fondo Centroamericano de Mujeres, Fondo Tierra Viva, AIDA, and WeDo. So that's who we are coming together. The project itself, so this is the accredited entity that accessed the funding is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The total amount for the project is 127, almost 128 million US dollars. And what's coming from the GCF is around 36 million. And the FAO is also the accredited entity, but also the executing entity of the funds. And also to note that this is one of the first projects that were approved for FAO, so it's quite an emblematic project for them. It's a 5-year project that started in 2019, and there have been some delays also due to COVID. And they're working with different ministerial agencies, such as the Agricultural Ministry and the Environmental Ministry in El Salvador, to implement the project. It's a very large project working in different municipalities, as you can see in the map here. And so we were very interested to know how this project was being implemented, particularly in the municipalities where a lot of our partners are working in, but also, for example, partners of the Fondo Centroamericano de Mujeres and Fondo Tierra Viva. The project itself has three components. So firstly, really looking at food production systems and really supporting families to get those food production systems going. The second component is about the restoration of ecosystems and degraded ecosystems, particularly due to large-scale agriculture. And the third component is about guaranteeing a political environment to really see a shift in these types of agricultural practices in the country. So the three components, and I mentioned them because they're important, as Rosalia will share later on. With the process itself, so as Berta was saying, this is new. This is not something that's been done a lot by other people. And so we were really inventing this or creating this process as we went along. And I would like to say that having the support from AIDA, WIDU, FECAM, Fondo Tierra Viva, coming together to work together and define this was important. We all brought different expertise into this. We initiated last year in November, so we're still going. It hasn't been completed. And we received funding for this. And I do want to say it's important that without funding, this wouldn't have been possible. So WIDU and Gaga provided some linking and learning funds for us to take this forward. And our monitoring project really has a gender aspect to it, given that we're part of Gaga and we all work on gender justice. And we're looking at two aspects. So one, if really looking at whether the project is fulfilling the commitments made in its funding proposal to the GCF, including stakeholder engagement processes. So really, how are people knowing about this process? Are they involved in this process and in the decision-making processes, as well as its gender action plan? And also, is the project addressing the needs and expectations of the community and the landscape, particularly with the gender justice lens? Oh, sorry, going too fast. And just a brief overview of what the stages have been. So this could be helpful for others if they're thinking of doing this. We firstly started with a preliminary desktop research, and then we moved into a planning and implementation of an on-site monitoring process. And here and this is where I want to talk about UNES, which is a national organization in El Salvador, a feminist, eco-feminist organization with a long trajectory working with the environmental movement in El Salvador, but always from a feminist lens, and has a wide range of partnerships and linkages with local communities across the country. So with them, we brought them into the project, and they have been leading the planning and implementation of this on-site monitoring, where they traveled to different municipalities, spoke to different entities that are part of the Reclima project and are implementing it in different municipalities, and are also holding different focus groups with community or based organizations that are directly involved with the project. In addition, they've also interviewed other organizations that aren't directly linked to the project, but are very much linked to the environmental justice movement, and we thought it was relevant to know how much they knew about the project, how involved they are or not, particularly looking at it from a transparency and accountability perspective. So we're currently at this stage 2. We'll soon be publishing the results. We're just missing a few more interviews. And then throughout, what we've been trying to ensure is a collective learning process. So participating in these spaces, but also with other organizations in Gaga, for example, really sharing what we've been learning so far and how it's been working. And finally, really ensuring also open and transparent communication with the accredited entity, so with FAO and the GCF Secretariat, because from our perspective, this monitoring process isn't about telling them how bad the project is, but rather about supporting them in strengthening their gender justice perspective in the project, right? So how can they strengthen their gender action plan? How can they make sure that women are not only participating, but really gaining power, leadership in these projects, right? We want the GCF to continue So we feel that these types of projects are about complementing and strengthening the work that's already being done to keep going forward. So there. I now would like to pass it on to my colleague Rosalia, who can share a little bit more about the on-site monitoring process, as she has been working with UNES to take this forward. So Rosalia, if you want to go ahead, introduce yourself, and I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. Good morning for everyone. Buenos días para todas y todos. Well, this process that Maite told you is, I think, has been interesting because we find a lot of lack, but also a rich information about how this process could be better. Not is bad by itself, is going how can be better. So we divide this consultant, the monitoring, in 4 indicators, and the first is the transparency and access to public information. So the project, as I told you, has a strength and weakness. It's not a bad project because they got the necessities, the local necessities. That is the problem that we have in El Salvador, in the local communities, with the agriculture and the food sovereignty. But the problem is that they are not related with the policies, because we have a complex national context, and I don't have time in that, but you know, it's a context that the policies that are not related with the necessities or the priorities of the local communities, and the inequalities has been berating still now. So another thing that we found that is the difficult in accessing information from FAO in this project is due to bureaucratic obstacles. So they have the initial presentation, but then if you need information, it's difficult to access. So if you are from the environmental movement or NGO, it's difficult to access that. So it's like this witness to the transparency in the access public that we are talking. Then we have this accreditation that is FAO, the organization, but there's another level that are the implementing organization. In here in El Salvador, we have a lot of, because it's all the Corredor Seco, so we have a different organization that has a lot of work in the communities. So they have induction process to manage the tools, the documents, and the approaches to do in the ground. That they work. Sorry for my dogs. they work with the component 1, that is all the agriculture, and then the activities that contribute is what they report. So the 3 components, the implementing organization only report to FAO the component 1. The 2 and 3, they are FAO and with other organization. For example, the component 2 is with SNET, the Meteorological Center. Okay, the second one, Maite, cool, please. Now we are Our focus, as Maite said, like Gaga and Guido and Nunes, is about the gender equity and local community participation. So the gender approach is based on binary logic. There is a lack of awareness of non-binary perspective. It's not only in the population in general, but it's the implementing organization. We need to move on and have to transfer capacities in the knowledge and the discussion of to change the gender approach in not only focus on binary logic. But also because this project has relates with the CECENIS, this indigenous organizations movement. There is no true intersectional perspective regarding needs, indicator, policies, or qualitative estimation of the effect that have this project on with the all activities. Another thing that we find in that we say because it's kind of we need to discuss that, but because if we work with the gender approach, it's not only the participation. You need to put the numbers that we have 30 women. No, that is the quality of the participations. So in this project is only the indicator is 35. For us is low because the focus of this project is to empower the woman in the agricultural sector. Another thing that is good, that is the higher hiring, the implementing organization that are hiring local female promote compared to male promote. And it's kind of that if we analyze this economic autonomy that are in the on the ground. Then we have this kind of wonder, a lot of questions about empowerment, because does the empowerment occur without contributing to structural change in equality? Who is the landowner de la finca? ¿Quién realmente es la persona dueña? And who has more time to participate? So this is a tricky question, but also a tricky indicator, because we say, okay, women are participating in all the activities, there are quality of participation, but if we are working in agriculture sector, the owner of the finca is our demand. So we are not struggle against the structural problem of gender inequality. And so for us, there are no strategies aimed at helping women gain power too. Yes, this project is contributing to gain access for the woman, but no control. And the exercise of hiding power projects that perpetuate the social reproduction of male dominance. And it's right that the women are participating, but the time in use is for them are more than the men, because they are still working in house with the careful task. The third one. So now that I told you that that I said that the component one, this is the really that we finding a lot of information because there's the implementer organization are working with different activities. So the project involves the participation of people who are part of the household. From the perspective of the interviewed woman, is already gaining the distribution of agriculture tasks. So it's interesting because the interview gave us this information that is a quality. Is kind of what the women are feeling, the effect that the land has to work with all the part of the household. The project promotes leadership to some extent, but it has a psychological impact of the reaffirmation and self-esteem. As I said, access yes, control no. Why? Because the time. I remember the comment that told me a woman that say this is the juggle to participate, but I'm happy to be part of this process. Then they are using Kobo Collect. That is, I think there is a ability that are gaining the promoters. The capacity transfer is based on learn by doing methodology. That is good. Women's leadership is based on established community organization structure. And yes, the component one, they are working with the food security, but not food sovereignty. So if we are talking in the context of the climate change adaptation, we need to have this perspective. That is the seeds, that is important, is the base. So the component 2 and 3, the preliminary findings, according to the information, there is a lack of knowledge about the progress of both components. But in the report delivered and published by GCF, they are reporting an advance. But FAOs told us that they not begin the meeting. They don't begin these components. So it's like a lack. We don't know. And the last one. Yes, next steps for you. Thank you.
I can do it. Thank you, Rosalia. Yeah, we're also being told that we have to wrap up because we also want to hear about the experience in Namibia. But as you can tell, the citizen process, the citizen observation process has actually proven to give a different perspective, a very more localized and perspective on the project, recognizing that there's advances, but as Rosalia said, there's some strengths and weaknesses on both sides, and we hope that the findings can contribute to strengthening even more this project that's being implemented in El Salvador. So for us, on our next steps, the report will be ready by the end of October. We've been doing many focus groups, interviews, and we still have a few interviews with FAO El Salvador, where it's been a bit challenging to get their participation, but they are on board and we've had several calls with them, so they're informed, so that's really great. We really want to use the coming months to share the findings on what came out of the process itself, so for the project, but also about the monitoring process itself. We believe that this should be done more and more by civil society organizations across the globe, as we see increasingly projects being implemented. And we obviously want to liaise with the GCF and FAO to support them further with the findings. No? So really use this relationship between civil society organizations and the GCF board and their accredited entities to take forward this work. So yeah, thank you. Sorry for being so rushed at the end. And we hope to share more soon.
Yes, thanks, Maite. And I hope we can come back with the questions to give you more time. But unfortunately, Toini has to leave soon. So we'll just have to rush through her presentation. Sorry about that. But Toini, just to not waste more time, if you can just make share your presentation, that'll be great. Thanks.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, I'll just close my laptop and maybe my presentation can also be set up.
Well, while I figure that, you can start if you want, and I'll just try to screen your presentation because you know, I thought you were doing it, but you can start and I'll figure it out.
Oh, okay. All right. Now that I'm actually logging in with my phone, because I don't know what's wrong with my laptop. Good afternoon, colleagues and participants viewing from across the globe. Of course, my name is Toini Amuteng, already introduced by Betha. But also just a point of correction, I am a research and communication officer for Triple Capital. And we consulted and work alongside with the Namibia Nature Foundation for the assessment of the monitoring and evaluation processes of the GCF project. The project that we assessed was the Empower to Adapt project, which is one of the 3 pilot projects of the Enhanced Direct Access projects of the GCF. And it was implemented with the aim of creating climate change resilient livelihood through community-based natural resource management in Namibia. The project was awarded at a micro level because of the entity, which is the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia. And it was implemented from 2017 to 2022 and was also offered an extension period to March 2023 due to COVID-19, and which affected implementation of some of the project activities. What was interesting about this project was that it has 2 components. The first component was awareness creation, where it was looking at building the capacity of communities to engage and understand the processes of applying for project funding. And then the second component was the grant facility project, where it was doing an on-granting to community-based organization to access climate finance. And it actually did an on-granting to 31 CBOs, which is now the community-based organizations in Namibia. Betha, are we gonna have the presentation up anytime soon?
Yeah, I think we're working on it because I don't have it, but the organizers do. There it is.
Okay, great. I think we can skip on through Betha's reflections, and then until my point of contribution, we can skip again. Kindly skip again. And again. And then again. All right, so that is a slide that was the background of the project that we did a monitoring and evaluation process on. And of course, yeah, we can now go into the monitoring and evaluation process. Upon the assessment of our monitoring and evaluation process, we actually had an intensive exercise that went on to, as explained by Berta, that we did field visits. And upon realizing, when we went into conversations with the accredited entity, we realized that we needed to set up our own form of monitoring and evaluation process, looking at the projects, especially the ones that were funded through on granting, because we were not able to assess them through the annual performance report, because there was a lot of changes in the indicators, and that made it very, very difficult for us to compare all the indicators as per the monitoring and evaluation process. In our assessment, we also realized that the monitoring and evaluation framework was unsuitable to assess the EDA projects, and these are the sub-projects that were on-granted through the grant facility. And this is because there was not really a clear alignment in terms of monitoring and evaluating projects related to adaptation and mitigation as identified by the indicators of the GCF. So there was like an unsuitable way to assess them. So we had to develop, to conduct a exploratory focus, discussion, and interviews in order for us to be able to assess these projects that were implemented by the communities. Yeah, so also what we have discovered through the research, as well as conducting the monitoring and evaluation process with the accredited entity, was that there was changes in annual performance reports in the templates in which they've used, especially in the reporting of 2018 and 2019, where we discovered that there was, changes in the project level indicators. We also discovered that there was, changes in the reports of 2018 and 2019 in terms of funding level indicators or fund level indicators. And then, of course, another change was in 2022, where the unit of measures of one of the core indicators also changed. And then, of course, there was, the gender disaggregation indicator that broke away in 2021. So all this impacted us, looking at those specific indicators. So what we rather did was, in our focus group, when we went into the field visits, we were looking at the projects and assessing them based on the CBO experiences, where we asked questions such as the background of the project from the on-granting beneficiaries, and in terms of the background of the project, what does it include? What were the main activities? Who were the parties involved? And what were their roles? And then we also went into understanding who were part of the designs of this project, which was very crucial in understanding, in order for us to understand how, how much capacity and contribution the community actually had because of the aim of this Empower to Adapt project. Also, some of the questions that we went on to assess were the experiences that included the success and the challenges of the project. In this case, we were talking directly to the Conservancy Management Committee, as well as the Forest Management Committee. Maybe just to sort of like dive a little bit deeper in terms of the Forest Management Committee and the Conservancy Management Committee. Namibia actually has, 86 community-based natural resources. These ones are now communal conservancies, and we also have about 42 community forests. And some of the projects that were awarded both come from community forest and as well as conservancy communal-based organizations. So that's why we had like a separation of like Forest Management Committee, and then in a capacity where the CBO is a conservancy, then we were speaking to the Conservancy Management Committee. We also spoke to the Project Management Committee, because this was also a component of the project on the grant facility, that entities were to come up with their project management committees who were to coordinate and ensure funding and reporting of the project on the ground. And the Project Management Committee were to work directly with the entities as well as the communities, but their role actually was more to engage with the accredited entity. And of course, some of the interviewers were also the Conservancy members, which we had focus groups with women and men as part of the beneficiaries of that CBO, in terms of the benefit, the challenges that they have, experienced with the on-grant project. And of course, traditional authority as well. We wanted to assess if there was, any familiar practices and the roles that they had played in the process. And of course, we did not leave out our accredited entity, which also really supported us in navigating which projects were, much more a challenge according to their books and reporting. And we could also really like assess and interview what were some of the challenges that they had experienced, so that they could also, the results could also support their next implementation of such an enhanced direct access project implementation in the future. I hope I'm still in time, Betha. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so here, I think this is just a map as well, indicating my previous a discussion that we actually interviewed 17 out of 31 projects. The on-branding offered 31 beneficiaries of the CBOs, or actually benefited 31 CBOs, and we did our visits in 17 of those awarded CBOs. And transitioning along, we could actually see much more of a difference in our assessment based on the questionnaires that we have drafted, looking at project sustainability and some of the recommendations that the CBOs could give from their own perspectives, were actually processes and indicators that came out in the project designs, where there was lack of ownership in some of the CBOs, because some CBOs actually did not have the capacity to develop their own project proposals. So they hired a consultant to actually develop a project on their capacity, and somehow this didn't actually allow them to learn the skills and practice the skills of designing their own projects. What we also observed was that in the governance, in the governance indicator or process of monitoring and evaluation, there were some governance issues. And these governance issues could actually be drawn back to the CBNRM governance structure of Namibia, because this is the structure that was followed by the on-grant, the grant facility of the EDA project. There was also issues with capacity, and it was actually drawn into the changes that was also observed between the entity and the GCF. There was a component of capacity building that the GCF removed during the funding process or disbursement of the funds for the project, which also affected the on-granting of the grant facility. So the capacity building monitoring and evaluation indicator actually showed that the removal of such an activity from the project proposal, or actually the disbursement from the GCF, impacted trainings on the ground, because then communities were not able to receive funding for training or to bring in experts to train. And maybe it will be interesting at this point to also touch on the kind of projects that were funded, just to draw back. So the kind of projects that were funded were actually in 3 windows. One window was touching on climate smart agriculture. The other window was on ecosystem based, and the other window was also in climate proof infrastructure. And some of the interesting projects that were funded were like fire management projects, where capacity must have been part of a component of the project in order for communities to gain the skills to extinguish fire, as well as training of managing the outbreaks of fire. And so removing the capacity building component or activity or funding has impacted the project largely. And of course, there were also borehole rehabilitation. And I think in this aspect, the major issue was that the entity, EIF itself, is a small, is granted on a micro level, so it can only access a certain amount of money, like $10 million US. And the other issue was that it is in the risk category C, and that it affected the level at which it could actually implement some of these projects. Beekeeping and honey production, the lack of capacity or funding for capacity affected accessing markets, or communities being introduced to markets and the likes, and as well as solar power plants. It would have been nice if communities were empowered in terms of how to do audits, and maybe how to create markets within their solar power plants, and many other projects that were funded, like poultry farms, breeding programs, livestock revolving funds, greenhouse, nurseries, plantation, backyard gardens, horticulture projects, drip irrigation system, feed system, hydroponics, bush to feed projects, as well as some flood relief centers as well. So going on to the monitoring and evaluation processes again, the grant management also was an indicator that showed us that, you know, there were some memorandum of understanding signed between support entities. It was upon the grant, the CBO was actually allowed to have a support entity in order for it to be able to have that support personnel to support it in the implementation of the project and maybe reach the appropriate suppliers and set up, you know, infrastructures that could really lead to sustainability. But some of the CBOs or the support entities really ended up really disappointing the communities in terms of deliverables. And yeah, so those are just a few indicators. Maybe we can go to the next slide so that I can round up my presentation. Yeah, so in terms of the recommendations that we had, I think there was also an issue related to ownership. And this one is actually leading us to the definition of us maybe redefining what direct access should look like to entities or to CBOs or any on-granting project that will be implemented in the future. In our perspective, we thought it should read something like, you know, an individual or groups who receive substantial livelihood, well-being or development, improvements such as employment, access to produce, water, sanitation, and other benefits. So it's like we wanted to redefine who the beneficiaries of direct access projects should look like or should be. So in that definition as well, we see it was drawn from the experiences that we had on the ground and looking at the effectiveness of the EDA project. We should take to account that this was a pilot project, and I think the outcome of this assessment could really lead into advancing the next enhanced direct access projects of the GCF. I think also we recommended that EDA requires more funding for monitoring and evaluation, capacity building, and governance. And this is also observed from the issues that were on the ground, especially in terms of monitoring and evaluation. Namibia is a vast, very, very diverse country in terms of landscape, and where the nearest CBO you can find could be 1,000 kilometers away, 500 kilometers away. So with little funding, it makes it very difficult for a project management unit to make it, or a monitoring and evaluation unit to make it out and do a lot of visitations. Because upon our assessment, it was that the number of visits that the MAU unit of the accredited entity did were actually 2. That is like the average number of visits, and that is not enough to ensure sustainability of the project and also understand the issues on the ground. In terms of the accredited entity, we actually recommend participatory development of indicators. And this is actually to bring on indicators that speaks to the projects on the ground and make sure that assessment is well observed, and also ensure that, you know, issues are monitored and also taken up right in advance before they escalate. I think also another recommendation that we had was the trade-off between ownership and support. I think entities were, what we recommended to entities that would be doing on-granting, they should actually look at the definition of ownership in terms of granting these projects to CBOs. What we have understood is the support entities, some of their support entities took on these projects as their own. There was also lack of ownership in terms of the designs of this project because of the level in which the communities were engaged. If members were mostly capacitated, maybe they would have come up with their own projects, and this could have, you know, impacted or positively influenced sustainability. So in this case, we recommend that there should be a trade-off between ownership and support, the kind of support that support entities should offer to on-grant projects. Yeah, not just outcome and output indicators. We also recommend that more meaningful impact indicators and processes should be brought on board. Yeah, and of course, this is actually in proposal in terms of the reports when it comes to the annual performance reports, maybe sticking to a format that doesn't really change a lot over time, or at least taking into consideration that projects that are already in the pipeline should stick to a certain annual reporting template until they have come to a lifespan of the end of the project. Otherwise, it makes it difficult to report and assess the progress of the projects over time. I think we also made a recommendation where we thought indicators must include adaptation and mitigation indicators, and it should be identified in a particular manner. So I think those are some of the recommendation and pickups from our side. Yeah, and I think I will end there, Betha.
Thanks very much, Toini, for that very interesting presentation. We are almost on time, but there are 3 questions in the chat that I think might take some time, like very short, to reply to, so that we don't leave them there. So actually, if you don't mind, Toini, before you leave, I'll address the first one to you on how can we integrate civil society. How can we integrate more, I guess, is the question, civil society in the evaluation and monitoring of approved projects. So if you have any ideas of how that could be done beyond these pilots, I would call them, that we have presented today.
That's a very good question, Betha. And I think, it actually touched base on what we picked up in the field as well. We have realized that, many of these CBOs were supported by non-government organizations or civil society organizations. They were formulated and supported and gazetted with the support of NGOs. And many of them have still those relationships with NGOs. In the on-granting as well as the support entity, the identification of support entities, when we came to that question of, transparency in terms of funding and sustainability, how do you see yourself maintaining the project activities that you have implemented or you have received in terms of this support? They often, draw us back into, having formed relationship with CBOs, and if only they could, forge those kind of relationship, they would impact or positively influence the sustainability of those projects. What we also see ourselves, taking forward in terms of the support that civil societies could do in supporting CBOs is especially with the the Enhanced Direct Access project that has been implemented. Quite interesting projects, very good infrastructures, but I think the lack of capacity is also influencing the community's ability to continue with these projects and continue accessing the benefits that are detailed in their project proposals. So the civil society could come in. If you are a civil society, for example, from the agriculture sector, you could offer your support or partner with a CBO to garden and produce, as well as establish the markets to ensure that this infrastructure continues to offer benefits to the CBOs and the communities at large. I think one of the interesting best practices that we saw within this project was that the establishment of market and the partnership between civil societies and these beneficiaries, where that a civil society had so much funding to ensure that activities go on, and it could then go into a benefit sharing agreement with a community-based organization, where the proceeds that would be made out of there will continue supporting the CBOs, and the opportunities that that project is providing could employ members from the CBO, and that could be a mutual benefit between CSOs, and this should not just be CSOs, it could also be private sectors who feel these kind of opportunities are great at a community level, and this kind of funding can be, invested to ensure that these projects continue to live beyond the end of a project or the lifespan of a project.
Thank you very much, Toini. There's another question. Well, there is one I think was addressed to me, so maybe I'll just, unless Maite, you want to add something beforehand. Okay, so I'll just be very brief because there's one for you, but I'll just answer this one because it's kind of linked to what Toini asked as well, which is how do these monitoring and evaluation activities help if the country is a police state or dictatorship where no local communities may act independently? I mean, that's obviously a very, very difficult question. It obviously, I think maybe what we haven't said in these discussion about our own, let's say, experiences is that there are certain conditions that need to be met. Of course, even when those conditions are technically there, sometimes, as you can see from the discussion by Maite, for example, it is not always easy to assert, let's say the legitimacy of civil society, if it exists, to carry out these activities, because often national governments, but also the accredited entities themselves, question the legitimacy of civil society doing this work independently. They question the independent evaluation of their projects. And so obviously that is made even more difficult if there is no, let's say, a civil society that can even do this, or if the national government is not willing or accepting of civil society participation and engagement or even existence. So this type of, let's say, project of pilots of monitoring and evaluation can only happen if certain conditions are met. And this is a conversation that's had at the GCF board level as well, when some members or some board members or civil society question the financing being given to countries where there are no democratic processes or no civil society, but that's very hard in the context of the GCF, because the GCF is works within the UNFCCC, and within the UNFCCC there are no conditionalities for accessing finance linked to democratic processes or so on. So, to a certain degree, it's really hard to stop that finance from going to countries where you don't have a participatory processes. And in those cases, it's also basically impossible to implement this type of approaches. On the other hand, we have spoken with the GCF, and there has been some suggestion that these processes could be institutionalized within the GCF. Whether that solves the problem you're raising, I don't know. But basically what that would mean is that projects and programs could have within their budgets a budget to finance civil society independent monitoring and evaluation. So that in that sense, it's already established as part of the package of funding for the project and program established by the GCF. And so there would be, some independent evaluation carried by civil society. It has not been implemented yet, but it has been, suggested by the GCF itself that they might try or are considering some pilots in which they would include funding for civil society-led monitoring and evaluation of projects as an addition to the normal monitoring and evaluation. So that would be my answer to that. And then the last question for Maite is about the conditions of working in El Salvador. So basically, linked to the government again, if the government of Nayib Bukele got involved, and what kind of involvement was it? Was it neutral, hostile, or positive involvement of the government?
Great, thank you, Berta. Yeah, I mean, linked conversation, and knowing that in many contexts it's not easy for civil society to engage in these processes. We, from the get-go, have been very clear that this is a citizen observation. So in no way are we monitoring or kind of holding kind of the government accountable. We're very much relating to the accredited entity, who is FAO, not the government of El Salvador. So it's FAO who we're working with, and that's who we've been engaging with. And although we have sent out requests to come to talk with the ministries that are involved in this project, there hasn't been a response so far. But as we are engaging with FAO, we feel like that is good enough for us as the accredited entity. As we want to make sure that we can continue working as a civil society organization, as civil society organizations in this context. So our positioning is always, we reach out, we ask, but we understand that they may not want to engage at this point. But as I said, FAO has been very responsive, or have been increasingly responsive to us regarding our requests, and they've been providing as much information as possible throughout. But unfortunately, with governmental entities, it's not been so easy. Rosalia, I think she's gone, but she has also been more engaged in that process. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Maite. And I think that that's all the time we have. We're already 6 minutes past the hour. So I want to thank all of the participants and, of course, all of the panel for their presentations. I think as Florencia said, the recording and the presentations will be shared with all the participants. And if you want more information, you can always reach out to us. I think that some of the emails are there as well. So just thank everyone again for your participation, and special thanks to our colleagues from AIDA who organized this series of webinars. And have a good day, everyone.